All right. Let's read Psalm 6 together. What I'm going to do with this, Psalm 6 is interesting because reading it quickly makes you lose most of it. I think as kids we were taught in school, when we read, try to read quickly, right through a text, try to read it accurately, try to read it loudly in some cases. But this isn't a text that needs to be sped through, okay? And it's just a good example of that. Psalm 6 has the heading "To the choir master with stringed instruments," according to the Sheminth. The Sheminth is probably some sort of musical instrument. We're not really sure. It's ascribed to David. It begins this way. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. My soul also is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there's no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. What strikes you about the psalm? What do you notice? What do you see there? What's being discussed? What do you come away with when you read that first glance?
Well, I believe it's a lament psalm.
I would agree.
He's lamenting his life.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he is extremely depressed, very anxious, seeking comfort from God, those kind of things, which is kind of interesting because he's just kind of laying it all out there to God, and I just think it's kind of interesting to look at.
And please understand the way I'm saying this is not to make light of anybody, but you mean God's people can be depressed? Of course they can.
Yes, they can, but they know where to go.
And of course they are from time to time. And Psalm 6 is like exhibit A of, one of God's people can feel that way, right? It's not inherently sinful to feel that way. It's honest is what it is, right? How this person, David, actually feels in that moment. All right. Yes?
You see that shift in verse 8 where if you lay it out before God and you just acknowledge that before Him, you immediately have that. He's heard me, and there's an answer here, and it's not all on my shoulders.
Yeah, it's from verses 1 to 7, and then verse 8 is like someone else walked in the room and began writing. It really feels like that. I mean, you can even see that. He goes from weary with moaning and flooding his bed with tears, and his eyes are weak. And then all the people who are attacking him, he's like, okay, y'all can go now because God's heard me. It'll be all right. It's like, you're not even the same person. But within David, you have both of those. You have the one who's been weeping, and then you have the one who now doesn't need to weep anymore. Right? Both of those can be carried. Yes, sir.
To me, it's like he got a load off of his chest and now he can go.
Absolutely. Interesting, that idea of load off of the chest, though. And I completely agree. What's interesting is when the load comes off of his chest. At what point in the process of, dealing with the trouble and kind of being over it, where is he in that process? Like if it starts with, I'm going through this extremely difficult thing. I cry out to God. God hears my prayer. God solves my problem. And then I'm fine on the other side, right? Where is he during this? When he says, depart from me, for the Lord has heard. Where is he in that process?
Prayer.
He is praying, right? But like going from, I have a problem to, the problem's over and I'm fine, where is he?
Well, the thought to me, he goes from being alone to being with God,
Okay.
having him on his side.
So calling God into the picture by prayer, okay, and joins him in that, yep.
Oftentimes we say we need to turn things over to God. And he has relieved himself of those and turned it over to God. A weight literally has been lifted off.
Right. Yep.
It's interesting to me is when we've had these type of conversations with people, you know, like, if you're gonna be okay, give it to God and that sort of thing, and then when we in turn do the same, we stop at verse 9. Verse 10 is very interesting.
Yep. What tense is verse 10 written in? Like past, present, future?
Future.
Future. So in that line of I have a problem, I cry out, God hears my prayer, God solves my problem, and I'm fine, God hasn't solved the problem yet. And yet he turns in verse 8 with confidence and says, you can all go away because he's heard me. My point back to what Todd was saying about the weight off the chest. What takes the weight off of his chest isn't when the problem's over. What took the weight off of his chest is when he called out to God and he knew that God heard his prayer, and that was enough. Right? That's an awesome thing to see. Is he's fine when everything else is still in this unsolved, pending kind of stage. He doesn't wait for it all to actually get better to say, okay, now I'm better. Isn't that interesting? I thought that was really, really telling as you work your way through. Okay? Other things you saw. What else do you see? So there's that big transition in verse 8. All right, what else? That's it. We got all of it in, 10 minutes.
You got done early.
We just crushed it. Yeah.
I'll be honest, I'm a little hung up on verse 10.
Okay, let's talk about it. Oh, let's back up and talk about it. All right?
Just because, would we ever tell somebody, hey, wish that those who have put you in this position are punished? You know, it kind of goes against almost your conscience, I guess.
Yeah.
Depending on who you are, right? But we really wouldn't tell somebody if we were giving, scriptural assistance, trying to lift somebody up and work through our time. We wouldn't say, and don't forget to wish, ill upon these people, that they will be put to shame in but a moment, right? So I don't know, it's kind of. Yeah.
Or you're sort of in that counseling moment with a person and someone has wronged them, right? And you go through you'll be fine, trust God. And while you're at it, make sure to make sure to tell that person that they're going to get theirs. All right. So, yes, sir.
Well, to me, it's almost like, well, I called 911, help's on the way, and you're gonna be in trouble.
Call the ambulance, but not for me, type thing.
Justice is coming.
Yeah. So, is it okay to call for God's enemies to be judged?
Sure.
That's the part and I'm with you. It's weird to sort of think about that. That idea of these people that are attacking me are doing so wickedly, and I want them to receive from God what they are trying to get. Right? I want God to act in both aspects of his nature. I want him to save the righteous, the faithful, and I also want him to do what he promised to the unfaithful. Right? The enemies here, they are not, they're not friendly with David. They're not on his side of things. They're opposed to him and opposed to God. So it's this idea that I'm calling out for God to do both aspects of his nature. Did I see a wave?
I was just, calling for vengeance, it's not an issue at all for a God who is perfect and who has perfect justice. I can ask God to avenge this situation. I don't know which one's right or wrong. I know how I feel in this situation, but he will execute perfect justice. And that's what this situation means. In as much as, we also look for that perfect mercy, I think as a result, they'd be resolved.
And I'm glad you mentioned that this is God who does this, because verse 10 is not, I'm going to do it. Right? Verse 10 is, this is what will happen. The enemies, they will be ashamed and they will be troubled. They will be turned back and put to shame, right? They will experience what David's experiencing now, because God's going to save David and he's going to destroy the enemies, right? God saves Israel, he destroys Egypt, right? You gotta have both. All right. One last swing at it. Anything else? Something you see interesting? Yeah.
You know, going to, when Kendrick was talking, it made me laugh because we as human, we want to wish they're punished. We also want to see them punished.
We kind of want to do it ourselves.
We kind- well,
if we really are honest.
But we want to see them punished, and
Right.
that's not God's plan.
No.
That's not how it's supposed to go. Even though we love, you know, the guy who, I don't know, does you some harm, you want them to go away to jail for as long as the judge will let them.
Yeah.
We may or may not see that, but they'll be punished eventually.
Right. So the question now is, what's the heart behind wanting that punishment to happen? If it's, well, they wronged me and I want them to do better. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If vengeance is, if our desire for God to judge the wicked is based on me, we've misplaced it. That's in parallel with something earlier in the psalm. Why does David say in verses 4 and 5 that God should save him?
Because God loves them. Steadfast love.
Right. But is it for David's sake? It's for God's sake. David says, save me for the sake of your steadfast love. Because you have said you are a God of Hesed. That's our word, right? Our good covenant love word, and it's translated mercy and faith, loving kindness and all kinds of other ways. He says, save me for your own sake, not for mine. And capitalizes on that in verse 5. If I die, Lord, what will happen? Then I'm not going to be alive to be able to praise you. When was the last time we ever prayed for a situation to get better for God's sake? That's a challenge. That's not normally the way we think about it. David's ultimate concern is with God. And it's telling in that he's obviously dealing with a problem, and he's obviously not dealing with it real well. But he still calls out for God to solve the problem, but again, not for himself, but for God's sake. Now, if that's true in verse 5, and verses 4 and 5, what about verse 10? Why would David want his enemies to be troubled and be put to shame? If he called out for God to save him because of God, why would he call out for God to judge? Same reason.
Right.
Because of God. Right? The same God that said he would show covenant love to his people, he would deliver the faithful, is the same God that said, I will judge my enemies. Right? Remember God's description in Exodus 34? He's, a God of steadfast love. He shows faithfulness to those who love him, and then he judges those who don't to the third and fourth generation. That's who God is. And so Psalm 6 shows both halves. Save me because of who you are, and judge them because of who you are. Not because of David personally. Right? Yeah.
I was thinking of Psalms 51 with what you said.
And rightly so.
If his enemies killed him, he wouldn't be there defending God. And when you look at 51, verse 10 says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence. Do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Verse 12, restore to me the joy of your salvation. Then verse 12, that's one of them, is then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners shall be converted to you.
Yep.
So it's kind of the same thought.
And 14 in that same chapter, right? My tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. The focus is always ever on God being benefited in the situation, right? Save me because of you, God, and judge them because of you. He brings up Psalm 51. In addition to lament, which definitely falls in that category, a lot of people categorize it further into psalms of penitence or the penitential psalms. Psalms that are marked by distress over a painful situation, normally because of sin. Normally the penitential psalms, I think there's 7 of them? Yeah. Are God is judging me because of sin and I'm suffering and I must have relief from it. And that's definitely how Psalm 51 feels, right? Remember the context for Psalm 51? It's also written by David. What had David just done?
Like you seem
He had sinned with Bathsheba, and then Nathan the prophet came in and told him, "You are the man," right? And then you have this psalm that he writes. And it's his suffering because God is heavy on him because of sin. Psalm 6 feels the same way. In fact, if you compare the first verse of Psalm 6 to Psalm 38, I think they're almost exactly the same. It's the same type of writing, right? You're going to see the same themes of weeping and despair and crying and those sorts of things. One thing that is interesting about Psalm 6, in Psalm 51, David says outright, "I've sinned," or some version of that phrase. Or he says, I've sinned, my sin's ever before me. Other Psalms, he does the same thing. Psalm 6, he never actually says, "I did a thing wrong," outright. Now, verse 1, if you come back and look at verse 1 has given a lot of people the impression that David is acknowledging his own wrong, right? Why would people, and the jury's split if you go read people who comment on Psalm 6. People think, well, he doesn't say anything, and then people are like, well, he absolutely says something, and then one writer says, neither one, he's sick. And I'm like, that's not it, so you throw him out. What about verse 1 would give you the impression that David is admitting wrong?
He asks God not to rebuke him
Why do you ask someone not to rebuke you?
because they've done something wrong.
You deserve rebuking, right? Don't discipline me in your wrath. What brings wrath? Sin. Discipline is, God trying to drag you back from the brink of sin and drag you back from committing it. So a lot of people read verse 1 and say, okay, David has obviously done something, and God's hand is heavy on him as a result. Now, what exactly God's doing to him is also up for discussion. Some people think from the psalm that David's literally suffering physically. He has some illness, right? God has brought some suffering on his body physically, and that's why he talks about, heal me for my bones are troubled, my soul's troubled. It's like I'm so sick, my soul's even sick. But then you get down to the end, and he's talking about how his enemies are going to be troubled, right? That's not how we talk about sickness. That's how we talk about like foreigners, or invading armies, that kind of thing. So there's some discussion as to what exactly is wrong with him, whether he's physically sick, whether he's just spiritually sick because of his sin, whether it's nationally sick, you might say, because of enemies that are invading. Really not sure. Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate what you just said, because what it reminds me of is we all have those times when we're caught in some type of snare.
Yep.
Right? And we know what it is, we know why it is, and how it is. We feel like we can't get out. And that sorrow and that constant grief for whatever this sin is that we continue to commit, whatever that has us ensnared, right? It literally, if your heart and mind are in the right place, it can really draw on you that much and make you feel sick and depressed, and you have lost the day, right? You have failed in this type of way, and you keep failing and failing, and you're growing weak and you're growing sick, and what's, that this is going on, whatever this is, and that to me is somebody who is kind of caught in that, that wheel, and it just continues to, and it's just making it fail.
You're feeling that feeling of sickness because you know better. And you know better ultimately because of God, because God has told you better. So to say that God is disciplining you, and even to pray that God would discipline us but not in wrath, right? Turn and change and rebuke me, but please don't do it in your anger, because who can hold up against that? So it's like, I recognize it's bad. Please don't do all of it like you can. That's a very real, raw sort of feeling, right? Don't discipline me like you could, right? If you were really, really angry. Yeah, Todd.
I wouldn't rule out the fact that he may not even know what he's done, or sometimes you feel like you're being punished, and it's like, what have I done, Lord? Me personally, and I assume a lot of people maybe, it's like, we know the verse, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And there's been times I feel like I must not be righteous because, he's not answering my prayer. Not
Yeah.
when I want or what I want or something. You can pray till you're blue in the face. And I feel like he's praying until he's blue in the face. And he may not even understand why he's in that.
That's an absolutely fair point. There's at least one person I read that was of that persuasion that Psalm 6 doesn't mention the sin because David doesn't know. He just knows, okay, everything's bad, and this is. I mean, what did Israelites attribute bad things to when bad things happen? Sin, right? Who sinned? This boy or his parents, right? From John 9, 8, somewhere in that range. That's the idea. And so some have suggested that very thing, that he doesn't know, but he just knows things are terrible, and that must mean it's my fault, and he goes to God for that, right? That's a fair observation. Anyway, we saw the structure, I believe. There is this sort of question, is what really is it that bothers David? Is it his sins or is it his enemies? Right? Verse 7, his eye grows weak because of all my foes. Right? And then in verse 10, it's the enemies that would be ashamed and turn back. Yet in verse 1, it's don't rebuke me in your anger. Right? So kind of the question is, well, which is it? Is he upset because, or is it centered with him, or is it centered with that which is without? I'm going to suggest to you it might be both. One of the curses of the covenant, one of the curses for turning away from God and sinning was that God would bring armies upon your nation, right? And there were many covenant curses, right? There was pestilence, there was famine, there was all kinds of things. But one of the things God said would happen if his people turned away from him is he would bring foreign armies in. And they would invade. Remember the time of the judges, right? Midian would invade in Gideon's time, and the Philistines would invade in Samson's time. That was one of the bad things that happened when you turn away from God. And so Psalm 6 might be this actually being carried out. Right? David, he's obvious there's sin in the camp, or at least sin in the person of David. And it may be the punishments being expressed by he's having to deal with these invaders, right? These foreign enemies. Just a thought, something to think about. I found this most interesting. Did you notice how many times he used the divine name? Like in your Bible, it's probably all uppercase Lord, right? When your Bible has all uppercase Lord, it stands for Yahweh. It's the Tetragrammaton. It's the official name of God, right? Covenant name of God. He uses it 8 times in 10 verses. And that may not sound like a lot. The average among all of the Psalms is 4 times. If you take all the times it happens in the book of Psalms, you divide it among all the Psalms, and I know 119 is a big one, but it happens average somewhere around 4 times. In 10 verses, he says the name 8 times. To me, that says whatever he's going through is really bad. Right? The sort of morbid example, but the one I always thought of, that came to mind when I thought about it. You've probably seen the old war movies when soldiers fall in battle, right? They fall and they know their time is up. What do they sometimes begin doing? They begin crying out for some family member, right? Mom, dad, brother, whoever it is, right? And it's heart-wrenching. And then I see David in the psalm repeatedly in the midst of his struggle saying God's name, right? Oh Lord, that's Yahweh, right? Be gracious to me, O Yahweh. Heal me, O Yahweh. But you, O Yahweh. He says it over and over and over again, right? This is someone in a lot of pain. And just, I think the presence of that shows. All right. Oh, goodness. Okay, stuff we can learn from it, stuff that the Israelites should have taken away from it. Number one, God does discipline people for their sins, and sometimes he uses wicked people to do that. That's not anything new in Israel's history, but it seems like David's having to go through that same sort of thing. And it's really, really not fun. It's telling to me that David says, rebuke me not in your anger. Right? Later on in the Psalms, there's this question about who can stand against God? And it's a rhetorical question because the answer is nobody. Should God decide to pour out his wrath on a person or on a nation, none could stand. They will not be able to come through it okay on the other side. And David, kind of recognizing that in verse 1, says, rebuke me, but don't do it like you could, right? Or even perhaps like he deserves, right? Don't discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, right? Grace is when you extend something that's undeserved. He recognizes that he does not deserve that. And then back to the point about why does he call out for God to save him? He never calls out for God to save, or he does call out to God to save him for his own sake, but it's like reason number 3 behind the first 2. Did you catch that? In verse 4, he says, turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. So reason number 1, David says I should be saved is, 1, because of your character. Because of God's stated character, you should save me, right? Because it would be in keeping with who you've said you would be. Reason number 2, verse 5. Paraphrasing this, if I'm dead, I won't be here to praise you. Right? Not if I'm dead, I'm dead. If I'm dead, there's one fewer people around who will praise you before others. Again, it's God-centered. And then finally you get the third reason in 6 and 7. What's the third reason he supplies for why God should save him? You don't have to read it. You just tell me the thought there. God should please save me because I'm hurting and I can't take anymore. Right? There's a little bit of poetic expression in verse 6, right? The human body does not have enough tears to be able to flood a bed. Okay? So what's he doing? He's giving you the sense of how he feels by exaggerating what he says, right? It happens a lot and it happens here, right? My eye wastes away because of grief, right? To me, that's that idea of someone is hollow-eyed. You think about someone who hasn't gotten enough sleep, right? Or they're going through some sickness and it's literally their face is drawing up. That's where David is at. That's how David feels. This is how bad it is. This isn't, this passing, not so difficult problem. This problem is killing him. Yep.
Did you say this was one of the penitential
Yes.
Psalms?
Yes.
There's like 7 of them or something.
Yes. Of the 7, this is the one where people go, I'm not really sure it belongs.
Do you see repentance here? I'm just curious.
They don't speak so much of repentance. They speak mainly of, I'm suffering because God's angry with me.
Okay.
Is the big key thing, right? Is I have sinned, and because of that, I'm in a bad way, and I need saving from that.
Okay.
That's the big thought of it. The thing that sets 6 apart is he never comes right out and says, I've sinned. You kind of have to draw it out of verse 1. But, yeah.
Well, and also verse 9, the Lord has heard my plea for help. So there could have already been a repentance at that point in time.
Maybe it was.
And then, Lord, this is the problem for me. This does have me ensnared. I am struggling with this.
Yeah.
Please help me.
Yeah. And he's losing. He is not fine and just asking for a little bit of a push across the line, right? He's fallen and he can't get up. That type of desperation.
And not arguing the question of whether he sinned or didn't, but it applies to all of us. You've seen situations where someone was unjustly treated.
Yeah.
Difficult things happen to us, and we know in every one of those, God is trying to use it for our improvement. He's trying to use it to destroy us. So when I think about the chastisement, the ability to make me better, to admonish me through things, they're still difficult situations.
Yeah.
And it may be weighing on me heavily. Somehow I know this is going to help.
Yeah. Sometimes they're brought on by sin, and often they're not. I mean, Job's your primary example of being devastated for no fault of his own, right? And then David is devastated usually because of fault of his own. It's just, it shows you both sides of it. What stuck out to me about verses 6 and 7, and I don't know why, but this is just the phrase I put on. Given enough pressure, everyone cracks. There's no one person out there that's just never, ever, ever going to break. There is some level, there's some situation, and there's some degree of suffering that will break a person. It's just a matter of time and pressure, right? Everybody cracks. The question is, what do you do then? What do you do after that, right? Who do you turn to? David is our example. He turns to God, and in doing so has just unbelievable, almost defiant confidence, 8 through 10, right? But 6 and 7 shows you that, yeah, everybody breaks if you give them enough. The visit with trouble. This was one of our questions. I don't know if you were able to look at those. I don't remember which question it was. Number 3. I asked, how is troubled used in the psalm? In 2 and 3, who's troubled? David, twice, right? He says that my bones are troubled, which is, again, not literal, right? Bones are bones, but it's an expression of how deeply I'm dealing with this. He's troubled, and then his soul is greatly troubled. So there's I call it the dog dare and the double dog dare, right? There's this intensive, don't ever get to triple, right? That's the rule. But there's this intensification. I'm troubled, now I'm greatly troubled, and then at the end, notice the enemies. They are greatly troubled. There's the reversal. What I was going through, they're going to go through, right? That it's not eye for an eye, but it's close, right? It's that reciprocal justice. The thing I'm going through is what my enemies are going to have to suffer.
And even worse for them, they don't have God to turn to.
That's the finality of it. Unless they turn to God, that's where they're going to be, right? They're going to be struggling with this. All right, I am way behind. But it's good. We've been having a good discussion. Okay, stuff for application. For one, does God still discipline people for their sins? Yeah. The God that did it then does it now. The difference is we don't have Nathan the prophet to show up to tell us that's what's happening, right? We don't have the prophets to show up and tell us, oh, your problem is just, we don't have it. We're more like Job than we are David. We suffer, and we may not know why. We suffer sometimes, and we know absolutely why. What happened to bring this about is because of my massive mistake. Sometimes we go through that. And then sometimes we're like Job, we suffer and we don't know why. In either case, we're being disciplined, right? This is Hebrews 12, right? Familiar. Man, the train never runs this time of night. Sorry, that blew my mind. I'm used to it on Sunday. Right? Hebrews 12, I just begin in verse 7. It's kind of skipping the quotation in 4 and 5. It's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you're left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? Right? For all the following verse, he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. Right? So whether our suffering is brought on by our own actions or just generally, the purpose of both is the same, is to drive people back towards God. Right? It was C.S. Lewis that said pain is God's megaphone. Right? Trying to get your attention. Hey, wake up, come to me, turn to me for your answers, for your peace, for your healing. That thought of who can stand against the wrath of God? What happens when you reject his son? David thought it was bad in his situation. How much worse will it be when you reject the ultimate expression of God's grace and mercy and love? Right? However bad it was for David, it's, unimaginable magnitudes worse if you reject Jesus, if you reject the gospel of Christ. Right? It's almost as if the Hebrew writer really even couldn't say how bad it was. Hebrews 10:31, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. The living God that was begged by David in verse 1, don't discipline me in your wrath. He will have no qualms doing so on the day of judgment if somebody rejects Jesus. Right? That's a sobering thing to think about. Did you have a thought?
There's nothing left. If you reject Christ, is there salvation, no other name.
Yeah.
verse 29 there, Kyle, is even more foreboding to me.
Yeah, you've outraged the Spirit of grace. Yep,
Outrage the Spirit of grace.
yep. David cried out that God would extend grace, be gracious to him. Jesus is the ultimate expression of that grace, right? If you turn away from that, then you put yourself in verse 10 in the psalm, is what you do. You put yourself in the category of those who are shamed in just a moment. Okay, I got to get to Jesus. If I don't do that, I'll have wasted all of our times. Connections between Psalm 6 and Jesus. The first one's just general, but the general ones count just as much as the others. In verse 2 of Psalm 6, David cries out for healing. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. What did Jesus do when he came to this earth? He went around healing people of various illnesses and casting out demons and even raising people from the dead. Jesus did, as a part of his ministry, exactly what David cried out for in Psalm 6, that someone would heal. God sent the healer. Even better, he sent the great physician, right? The one who would heal people not just from illness, but from sin. In verse 3, David says, my soul is greatly troubled. That reminded me of Jesus in the garden. You remember when he's preparing to pray to his Father, maybe in a very similar frame of mind as David in Psalm 6. Right? David in Psalm 6 is weary with moaning and flooding his bed with tears. How do we suppose Jesus felt in the Garden of Gethsemane? Whatever it was David was feeling, Jesus was feeling something worse. Right? Magnitudes worse, right? To the point where, he's sweating drops of blood. He says in Matthew 26:38, my soul is very sorrowful. It's a different word if you were able to translate it to Greek, but it's the same idea. What's even more interesting, the word troubled in verses 2 and 3, when the Old Testament was translated to Greek, the Septuagint, the word that was picked for troubled is the word tarasso. Tarasso is the same word Jesus uses in John 12:27. When he's having the conversation with his disciples, or getting ready to have this conversation with the disciples in John 12. And he says, now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I have come to this hour. It's just interesting that when the New Testament was written, they picked the same word that the Jews had translated Psalm 6:3 into to describe what Jesus was going through, right, prior to his arrest and crucifixion. There is one quotation. In verse 8, David says, depart from me, all you workers of evil. That should have sounded familiar as we read through. Except when Jesus uses it, it's very different. Right? Jesus uses it in Matthew 7. Now tell me the story that this comes from. All right? Jesus tells those who don't obey, I never knew you, depart from me. What's the context? What's the story? Right? He's describing judgment, okay? What happens just before this verse in Matthew 7? Yeah. Yeah. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not? All right? They start making the list. Do many mighty works in your name. The enemies are going to show up one day and say, look at all the things we did. And Jesus is going to say, interesting. He says the thing David says when David's at the very bottom of his pit. When David prays to God and he knows God will deliver, he says, depart from me, all you workers of evil. Jesus, at the moment of judgment, isn't at the bottom of his pit. He's at the top of the mountain. He is King of Kings. He is reigning. He is presiding over judgment itself. And when he tells the enemies to go away, he uses the same words that one of his servants used when he was at the very bottom of his despair, and he cried out in faith, telling his enemies to go away. Right? That is an extreme reversal. David cried out those words in despair, Jesus is going to use them in victory, right, over the enemies of God. What David hoped and was confident that God would do by saying such a thing, Jesus is going to do. He is going to accomplish that what David wanted so bad. Right? Love that. Just love that connection between the two. In verses 8 and 9, the psalmist David, he says, God has heard the sound of my weeping. It says the same thing about Jesus in Hebrews 5:7. Right? It says that Jesus cried out, with prayers and cries, and he was heard for his reverence. It says that there. Same idea. What David did, Jesus would end up doing. David's enemies are going to be ashamed. The very last words of verse 10, they shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. Like in the blink of an eye, all of a sudden they're going to turn around and everything's gone. How does Jesus come back? Is it right? Do we have to vote and we have to make sure all the states put their votes in and then we get to inaugurate? No, there's no counting electoral votes with Jesus. It's just he's here and that's it, right? And all those who are opposed to him, it's over. And it's over just as suddenly as David said it would be, right? In a moment, right? In the blink of an eye, it's going to happen. That's the way Jesus will come back, and that's how he's going to judge his enemies, right? Jesus will fulfill what David wanted God to, or what David said would happen to God's enemies. Jesus is going to carry that out in the same fashion, right? In a moment. So just another just awesome connection. All right, there was one I wanted to make sure I said. Well, never mind. I'm out of time. All right. Now, next week, of course, we have our gospel meeting, so Psalm 7 will have to wait. I hate that because I'm itching to keep going. I've been off at Psalms for too long. So the following Wednesday, the 20th, Lord willing, we're going to go to Psalm 7. All right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your comments and your reading outside of class and kind of preparing for the discussion. It makes it a lot better when we all bring something. All right. Thank you, guys.